November 26, 1929, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries shipyard in Yokohama. As winter fog rolls off Tokyo Bay and naval architects huddle over blueprints that will challenge the very foundations of international law. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 stands as the world's first arms control agreement, a document that explicitly defines aircraft carriers as vessels exceeding 10,000 long-ton standard displacement, but Japanese naval planners have discovered what they believe to be the perfect loophole. If a ship carrying aircraft weighs less than 10,000 tons, the treaty declares it is not an aircraft carrier at all, which means the Imperial Japanese Navy can build such vessels without restriction, without counting them against their allocated tonnage, and without asking permission from America or Britain. The stakes could not be higher in this calculated gamble against the treaty system that emerged from World War I's devastation. Japan's naval ambitions stretch across the Pacific Ocean, but the Washington Naval Treaty has shackled the Imperial Japanese Navy to a 5-to-5-to-3 ratio against the United States Navy and Royal Navy, forcing Japanese admirals to accept permanent inferiority in capital ship tonnage. However, aircraft carriers represent the future of naval warfare, and the Japanese delegation that signed the treaty in 1922 has inadvertently left a gap in the language that sharp-eyed naval bureaucrats in Tokyo believe they can exploit without technically violating international law. Commander Toshio Matsunaga stands on the construction platform at Mitsubishi's Yokohama yard, watching workers lower the first steel plates that will become the keel of a vessel designated simply as Light Aircraft Carrier No. 1 in the Naval Construction Program. Matsunaga has spent months as the chief equipping officer for the massive aircraft carrier Akagi, learning every detail of carrier operations, air group management, and the delicate balance between aircraft capacity and ship stability. Now he faces an entirely different challenge, overseeing the construction of a carrier that must remain under 8,000 metric tons to exploit the treaty loophole while carrying enough aircraft to justify its existence. The engineering requirements border on the impossible, demanding that Japanese shipbuilders create a vessel with the aircraft capacity of a fleet carrier while maintaining the displacement of a heavy cruiser. Mitsubishi's design team has proposed a radical solution, building the ship on a light cruiser hull with minimal armor protection, no defensive armament beyond basic anti-aircraft guns, and a single hangar deck to keep weight as low as possible. The resulting vessel will stretch 179.9 meters in length with a narrow beam of just 20.32 meters, creating a length-to-beam ratio that pushes the boundaries of naval architecture and threatens the ship's fundamental stability. Chief Engineer Yokoyama Tadamian reviews the weight calculations for the third time this morning, knowing that every ton matters in this delicate balance between treaty compliance and operational capability. The ship's hull must be built without armor protection, using only minimal splinter plating around the machinery spaces and magazines, while the superstructure will be kept to an absolute minimum to save weight. Even the bridge will be tucked under the forward edge of the flight deck rather than built as a traditional island superstructure, forcing the ship's officers to navigate and control air operations from a cramped greenhouse-like structure that offers limited visibility. The launch date of April 2, 1931, arrives with considerable fanfare at Mitsubishi's Yokohama facility, where the light aircraft carrier slides down the ways into Tokyo Bay with hundreds of naval officers and government officials watching from the viewing stands. The ship bears the name Ryujo, meaning prancing dragon, a designation that carries both pride and subtle irony, as this particular dragon will spend much of its career struggling against the fundamental physics that govern ship stability. The vessel's sleek profile and unusual configuration draw admiring comments from observers who see innovation and cleverness in the design, but experienced naval architects note with concern the ship's high freeboard and narrow beam. Captain Matsunaga assumes command of Ryujo on December 1, 1931, beginning the complex process of fitting out the carrier with her aircraft handling equipment, defensive armament, and the specialized systems required for flight operations. The ship's single hangar measures 102.4 meters in length and 18.9 meters in width, providing space for approximately 24 aircraft in the original design. But naval planners have already begun demanding modifications that will double the ship's aircraft capacity to 48 planes, requiring the addition of a second hangar deck that will fundamentally alter the vessel's weight distribution and center of gravity. The addition of the second hangar transforms Ryujo from a marginally stable vessel into a floating crisis waiting to happen, raising the ship's freeboard to 14.9 meters and creating a top-heavy configuration that violates basic principles of naval architecture. Sperry active stabilizers are installed in a desperate attempt to counteract the ship's tendency to roll heavily in even moderate seas. But these mechanical devices cannot overcome the fundamental problem of a vessel whose center of gravity sits dangerously high above the waterline. The narrow beam that allowed the ship to remain under the treaty tonnage limit now becomes a liability that threatens the lives of everyone aboard. Sea trials in June 1933 reveal the full extent of Ryujo's stability problems as the carrier struggles through basic maneuvers in Tokyo Bay, while her crew fights to maintain their footing on decks that pitch and roll with alarming violence. The ship achieves her design speed of 29 knots, but she ships water heavily over the bow in moderate seas and exhibits a pronounced tendency to list when turning at speed. Aviation operations prove particularly challenging as the ship's violent motion makes it difficult for pilots to land safely on the narrow flight deck, while the aircraft handling crews work in constant fear of being thrown against bulkheads or over the side during heavy rolls. Commander Hashimoto Sadao, serving as Ryujo's air officer, reports to Captain Matsunaga that the ship's motion characteristics make it nearly impossible to conduct safe flight operations in anything but calm seas, limiting the carrier's operational utility and calling into question the entire concept of a light aircraft carrier. The ship's initial air group consists of 9 Mitsubishi B-1M2 torpedo bombers and 3 Nakajima A-1N1 fighters. But even this modest complement proves challenging to operate effectively due to the vessel's instability and the cramped conditions created by the doubled hangar arrangement. The harsh reality of Ryujo's design flaws becomes undeniable during fleet exercises in the autumn of 1933, when the carrier operates alongside the fleet carriers Akagi and Kaga in the Sea of Japan. The larger carriers maintain steady flight operations throughout the exercise period, launching and recovering aircraft with practiced efficiency, while Ryujo struggles to keep pace with the formation and frequently suspends air operations due to excessive rolling. Captain Matsunaga submits a detailed report to Naval Headquarters outlining the ship's limitations and recommending immediate modifications to improve stability, but his warnings are initially dismissed by staff officers who remain committed to the treaty circumvention strategy. The torpedo boat Tamazuru capsizes in heavy weather on March 12, 1934, taking 100 crew members to their deaths and sending shock waves through the Imperial Japanese Navy as admirals realize that their strategy of building heavily armed vessels on lightweight hulls has created a fleet of potentially unstable warships. The Tamazuru incident triggers a comprehensive stability review of all Japanese naval vessels, with particular attention focused on ships built to circumvent treaty limitations through weight-saving measures that compromise basic seaworthiness. Admiral Kato Hiraharu heads the investigation committee that examines every aspect of Ryujo's design and construction, conducting detailed stability tests that confirm what Captain Matsunaga and his crew have experienced firsthand during their months at sea. The carrier's metacentric height proves dangerously low, her center of gravity sits too high above the waterline, and her narrow beam provides insufficient reserve buoyancy to handle the weight of a full aircraft complement and fuel load. The committee's recommendations call for immediate modifications to strengthen the ship's keel, add ballast to lower the center of gravity, and install shallow torpedo bulges to increase beam and improve stability. Ryujo enters Kure Naval Arsenal on May 26, 1934, beginning a comprehensive reconstruction program that will keep the ship out of service for nearly 3 months, while engineers work to correct the fundamental flaws in her design. The keel is strengthened with additional steel plating, hundreds of tons of ballast are installed in the ship's lower compartments, and shallow torpedo bulges are welded to the hull to increase beam and provide additional buoyancy. The ship's funnels are moved higher up the side of the hull and curved downward to keep smoke and exhaust gases away from the flight deck, while various topside equipment is removed or relocated to reduce weight above the waterline. Captain Ichiro Ono assumes command of Ryujo on November 15, 1934, inheriting a vessel that has been significantly modified but remains fundamentally compromised by the original decision to build a large aircraft carrier on a small ship's hull. The carrier becomes the flagship of Rear Admiral Haido Wada's 1st Carrier Division, a prestigious assignment that masks the reality that Ryujo represents a failed experiment in treaty circumvention rather than a successful innovation in naval design. The ship's crew now numbers 600 officers and enlisted men, all of whom must adapt to the unique challenges of serving aboard a vessel that remains temperamental in heavy weather despite the extensive modifications. The London Naval Treaty of 1930 has already closed the loophole that allowed Ryujo's construction, adding Article 3, which specifies that aircraft carriers below 10,000 tons will also be counted against each nation's total carrier tonnage, making the Japanese investment in light carrier technology a strategic dead end. No additional ships of Ryujo-S type will be built, leaving her as a unique vessel whose design compromises serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing treaty compliance over operational effectiveness. September 25, 1935, brings the Fourth Fleet incident as Ryujo and other Japanese warships encounter a massive typhoon during fleet exercises southeast of Hokkaido, with wind speeds reaching 39 knots and wave heights that challenge even the largest vessels in the formation. The carrier's flight deck and superstructure suffer significant damage from the pounding seas, while her hangar spaces flood through damaged weather seals and inadequate drainage systems. Two destroyers in the exercise force, Hatsuyuki and Yujiri, have their bows torn completely away by the storm, graphically demonstrating the consequences of building warships that prioritize armament over structural integrity. The typhoon damage forces Ryujo to return to Kure Naval Arsenal for additional modifications, including raising the forecastle one deck higher and adding more flare to the bow to prevent the ship from shipping water in heavy seas. The bridge structure is rounded and streamlined to reduce wind resistance, while the forward edge of the flight deck is also rounded, shortening the available runway length by 2 meters but improving the ship's ability to handle rough weather. These modifications increase the ship's beam to 2078 meters and her draft to 7.08 meters, while her displacement grows to 10,600 metric tons at standard load, officially pushing her above the treaty limits that her construction was designed to circumvent. Lieutenant Commander Yamada Ichiro, serving as Ryujo-S operations officer, notes in his private diary that the ship's modifications have improved her seaworthiness but at the cost of compromising the very treaty compliance that justified her existence, making her a vessel that violates international agreements while remaining operationally inferior to proper fleet carriers. The carrier's air group has been expanded to include Aichi D-1A dive bombers and Nakajima A-2N fighters, but her small size and persistent stability issues limit the effectiveness of air operations compared to the larger carriers Akagi and Kaga. The Second Sino-Japanese War provides Ryujo with her first combat operations as part of the 1st Carrier Division's deployment to Shanghai in August 1937, where the carrier's aircraft support Japanese ground forces advancing on the Chinese commercial center. The ship operates alongside Kaga in the East China Sea, launching bombing raids against Chinese airfields and providing air cover for Japanese naval forces. But her limited aircraft capacity and weather restrictions constrain her effectiveness compared to larger fleet carriers. Flight operations from Ryujo prove challenging even in the relatively calm waters off the Chinese coast, as the ship's narrow flight deck and unstable platform make landing approaches dangerous for inexperienced pilots. Lieutenant Sato Kenji, flying an Aichi D-1A dive bomber from the carrier, reports that landing aboard Ryujo requires exceptional skill and concentration due to the ship's tendency to roll unpredictably and the limited margin for error provided by the narrow deck. Several aircraft are lost to operational accidents during the Shanghai campaign, including one dive bomber that slides over the side during a particularly violent roll while being positioned for takeoff. The carrier's anti-aircraft armament proves inadequate during engagements with Chinese aircraft, as her 6 single-mount 12.7 cm guns and 12 single-mount 25 mm automatic cannons lack the firepower density needed to defend against determined air attacks. Chinese Curtiss Hawk 3 fighters successfully penetrate Ryujo-S defensive screen on several occasions, forcing the carrier to rely on her embarked fighters for protection while highlighting the vulnerability created by minimal defensive armament. The weight savings achieved by reducing the ship's anti-aircraft suite prove costly when Chinese bombers target the carrier during daylight operations near Shanghai. Captain Katsuo Abe assumes command of Ryujo in November 1937, taking over a vessel that has proven its operational limitations during the Chinese campaign while remaining valuable as a training platform for carrier aviation tactics and procedures. The ship returns to Japan for another refit period, during which her anti-aircraft armament is upgraded with additional 25 mm guns and her aircraft handling equipment is improved to accommodate newer aircraft types that are entering service with the Imperial Japanese Navy's air arm. The outbreak of World War II in the Pacific finds Ryujo serving as flagship of the 4th Carrier Division under Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakuta, operating in support of Japanese expansion across Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies. The carrier participates in the invasion of the Philippines on December 8, 1941, attacking American naval facilities at Davao on Mindanao with her complement of Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers and Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters, demonstrating improved combat effectiveness despite her persistent design limitations. Operations in the Malayan Peninsula during December 1941 and January 1942 showcase both Ryujo's capabilities and her constraints as the carrier provides air support for Japanese amphibious landings while operating in the confined waters of the South China Sea. The ship's aircraft attack British airfields and port facilities, contributing to the rapid collapse of Allied resistance in the region, but her limited aircraft capacity and vulnerability to rough weather restrict her operational flexibility compared to larger fleet carriers in the same task force. The Second Battle of the Java Sea on March 1, 1942, involves Ryujo's aircraft in the pursuit and destruction of Allied naval forces retreating from the Dutch East Indies, with 6 B-5N torpedo bombers from the carrier attacking and sinking the abandoned American destroyer Pope after her crew had been rescued by other vessels. This successful attack demonstrates the effectiveness of Ryujo's air group when properly employed against surface targets, but the limited size of her aircraft complement prevents the carrier from conducting sustained operations without frequent resupply and aircraft replacement. The Indian Ocean Raid of April 1942 sends Ryujo and a small task force into the western reaches of the Indian Ocean to attack British merchant shipping and coastal installations, operating independently from the main Japanese carrier force that strikes Ceylon and other major targets. The carrier's aircraft attacked the small ports of Kokonada and Visakhapatnam on the Indian coast, claiming to sink 2 vessels and damage 6 others, while Ryujo herself uses her main battery to sink 3 additional merchant ships by gunfire, demonstrating the vessel's ability to conduct independent operations despite her design limitations. Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakuta leads Ryujo and her escorts toward the Aleutian Islands in June 1942, as part of the complex Japanese operation that includes the attack on Midway, with the carrier tasked to strike American installations at Dutch Harbor and support potential landing operations in the island chain. The Aleutian operation unfolds as planned with Ryujo's aircraft attacking Dutch Harbor on June 3 and 4, causing significant damage to American facilities while demonstrating the carrier's ability to operate in the harsh weather conditions of the North Pacific. The success at Dutch Harbor proves to be Ryujo's last significant victory as the carrier returns to Japanese waters in time to participate in the desperate attempt to reinforce Japanese positions on Guadalcanal following the American invasion of August 7, 1942. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons will test every aspect of the carrier's design and crew training as Admiral Chuchi Nagumo detaches Ryujo from the main carrier force to provide air cover for a transport convoy carrying troops and supplies to the embattled Japanese garrison. August 24, 1942. Dawns clear and calm in the waters northeast of Guadalcanal as Ryujo steams in company with the heavy cruiser Tone and destroyers Amatsukes and Tokitsukes, preparing to launch airstrikes against Henderson Field, while remaining close enough to provide cover for Admiral Tanaka Reizo's transport convoy. Captain Tadao Kato, now commanding Ryujo, orders the carrier to launch 15 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters and 6 Nakajima B-5N bombers at 12:30 p.m., sending them toward the American airfield in coordination with planned attacks by land-based aircraft from Rebel. The American radar station on Guadalcanal detects Ryujo's aircraft as they approach Henderson Field, alerting Marine Fighter Squadron 223 and other defending units to prepare for the incoming attack. Captain Kato's decision to commit his strike aircraft leaves Ryujo with minimal air cover just as American search aircraft from the carriers Enterprise and Saratoga locate the Japanese detached force and report its position to Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's Task Force 61 operating southeast of the Solomons.
Commandé Haridé.
Felt leads 31 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers and 8 Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers from USS Saratoga toward the reported position of the Japanese force, flying without fighter escort due to the extreme range of the mission but confident in the ability of his experienced aircrew to penetrate Japanese defenses and attack the enemy carrier. The strike group climbs to attack altitude as they approach the target area, with Felt's bomber crews preparing for a coordinated assault that will test Ryujo's defensive capabilities and structural integrity. Lieutenant Commander Tanaka Yoshiro, serving as Ryujo's air officer, watches helplessly as American aircraft appear on the horizon at 3:50 p.m., Realizing that his carrier has been caught with most of her fighters committed to the Henderson Field attack and insufficient defensive aircraft available to repel a determined assault. The ship's anti-aircraft guns open fire as the American dive bombers begin their attack runs, filling the sky with bursting shells and tracer fire, but the 6 triple-mount 25mm guns recently installed during the carrier's latest refit prove inadequate against the concentrated American attack. Captain Kato orders hard rudder to starboard as the first wave of SBD dive bombers begins their near-vertical descent toward Ryujo's flight deck, but the carrier's narrow beam and high center of gravity limit her ability to maneuver effectively, while the American pilots adjust their aim points to compensate for the ship's evasive actions. The first bomb strikes near the forward elevator, penetrating the thin flight deck plating and exploding in the upper hangar space where aviation fuel and ammunition create secondary explosions that rip through the ship's unarmored interior compartments. Lieutenant Junior Grade Robert Elder, flying an SBD from Bombing Squadron 3, releases his 1,000-pound bomb at the optimal release point and watches it strike Ryujo's flight deck just aft of the island structure. The explosion sending debris and flame high into the air, while opening a massive hole in the carrier's vital deck area. 2 additional bomb hits follow in rapid succession, with one penetrating into the lower hangar space and another striking near the stern, while a torpedo from Commander Felt's TBF Avengers tears open the ship's starboard side and floods the unprotected engine and boiler rooms. Damage Control Officer Lieutenant Hayashi Keisuke leads his team into the flooded compartments below decks, fighting through rising water and toxic smoke as they attempt to shore up damaged bulkheads and restore power to critical systems. But the carrier's minimal armor protection and lightweight construction make effective damage control nearly impossible once the ship's hull integrity has been compromised. The torpedo hit has jammed Ryujo's steering gear while massive flooding causes the ship to develop a pronounced list to starboard that grows steadily worse as seawater pours through the damaged hull. The American attack has lasted less than 10 minutes, but the concentrated bombing and torpedo strike have inflicted fatal damage on a carrier whose design prioritized treaty compliance over survivability, leaving Captain Kato with a burning, flooding vessel that cannot maintain course or speed while her crew fights desperately to save their ship and their lives. Ryujo's narrow beam, which allowed her to remain under the treaty tonnage limit, now prevents the ship from maintaining stability as flooding progressively worsens the vessel's list and threatens to capsize her completely. Chief Engineer Commander Watanabe Susumu reports to the bridge that the main engineering spaces are completely flooded. All power has been lost to the propulsion plant, and the ship's pumping systems cannot keep pace with the inflow of seawater through the torpedo damage and bomb-induced hull fractures. The carrier's list increases to 20 degrees by 4 p.m. and continues to worsen as the crew abandons any hope of saving their ship and focuses on preparing for evacuation while fighting fires that threaten to spread to the remaining aviation fuel and ammunition stored throughout the vessel. Captain Kato gives the order to abandon ship at 3:15 p.m. as Ryujo's list exceeds 30 degrees and the carrier begins showing unmistakable signs of impending capsize, with her flight deck edge approaching the waterline and internal bulkheads collapsing under the stress of progressive flooding. The destroyer Amatsuke's approaches the stricken carrier to begin rescue operations while her sister ship Tokitsuke's provides anti-aircraft defense against additional American aircraft that arrive to attack the crippled vessel with high-altitude bombing that proves ineffective but adds to the chaos and confusion surrounding the evacuation. The crew of Ryujo abandons their ship in good order despite the desperate circumstances, with officers ensuring that classified materials are destroyed and that all personnel have opportunities to reach the life rafts and rescue vessels standing by to assist in the evacuation. 120 officers and enlisted men perish in the attack and subsequent sinking, while the majority of the ship's company survives to be rescued by the Japanese destroyers that risk their own safety to save lives from the water. Ryujo capsizes completely at 5:55 p.m. on August 24, 1942, rolling over to starboard and sinking by the stern as her structural integrity finally fails under the combined effects of battle damage, progressive flooding, and the fundamental stability problems that had plagued the vessel throughout her career. The carrier takes with her 14 aircraft that were returning from the Henderson Field strike, their pilots forced to ditch in the ocean when they find their ship sinking beneath the waves of the Solomon Sea. The sinking of Ryujo represents more than the loss of a single aircraft carrier, marking the end of Japan's experiment with treaty circumvention and the failure of a design philosophy that prioritized legal compliance over operational effectiveness and crew safety. Post-war analysis by American and British naval architects confirms that the carrier's fundamental design flaws made her vulnerable to exactly the type of concentrated air attack that sank her, with minimal armor protection, inadequate compartmentation, and poor stability characteristics contributing to her rapid loss once battle damage exceeded her limited damage control capabilities. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's assessment of the Guadalcanal campaign acknowledges that the loss of Ryujo, while tactically insignificant compared to larger fleet carriers, represents a strategic failure in Japanese naval construction policy that wasted valuable resources on vessels that could not effectively fulfill their intended missions. The experiment with light aircraft carriers built to exploit treaty loopholes has proven to be a dead end that diverted resources from more effective ship designs while producing vessels that were operationally compromised and tactically vulnerable. Captain Kato's final report on the loss of his ship, written after his rescue and return to Japan, provides a detailed analysis of Ryujo's performance during her final battle and throughout her operational career, noting that the carrier's design limitations made her unsuitable for sustained combat operations against a determined enemy equipped with modern aircraft and weapons. The narrow beam that allowed treaty compliance created stability problems that persisted throughout the ship's career, while the minimal armor protection and lightweight construction that kept displacement low made effective damage control impossible once the vessel sustained significant battle damage. The strategic lessons learned from Ryujo's construction and loss influenced Japanese naval planning for the remainder of World War II, with subsequent carrier designs emphasizing operational effectiveness over treaty compliance and incorporating improved armor protection, better compartmentation, and enhanced damage control capabilities. The Taiho and Shokaku-class carriers represent the evolution of Japanese carrier design toward vessels that prioritize survivability and combat effectiveness over the legal technicalities that shaped Ryujo's flawed configuration. American naval intelligence analysis of Ryujo's design and performance, based on captured documents and interrogation of survivors, confirms that the Japanese attempt to circumvent the Washington Naval Treaty through innovative ship design had produced a vessel that was fundamentally unsuited to modern naval warfare. The carrier's narrow beam, high center of gravity, minimal armor protection, and inadequate damage control capabilities made her a liability rather than an asset in fleet operations, while her limited aircraft capacity restricted her ability to contribute meaningfully to major naval campaigns. The technological legacy of Ryujo extends beyond her immediate tactical impact to influence post-war understanding of the relationship between international arms control agreements and military effectiveness, demonstrating that attempts to circumvent treaty limitations through clever design solutions often produce weapon systems that are operationally compromised and strategically counterproductive. The carrier's career serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing legal compliance over sound engineering principles and operational requirements. British Admiralty assessment of Japanese carrier design, compiled after the war using captured technical documentation and survivor interviews, concludes that Ryujo represented a fundamental misunderstanding of aircraft carrier requirements and capabilities, with her designers focusing on treaty compliance rather than the operational demands of carrier aviation in modern naval warfare. The vessel's persistent stability problems, limited aircraft capacity, and vulnerability to battle damage made her unsuitable for the demanding conditions of Pacific naval operations where carriers were expected to operate independently for extended periods while sustaining high-tempo flight operations. The ultimate irony of Ryujo's story lies in the fact that her construction violated the very treaty provisions she was designed to circumvent, as the addition of the second hangar deck required to achieve meaningful aircraft capacity pushed her displacement above the 10,000-ton limit that defined treaty restrictions on aircraft carriers. The ship's final displacement of 10,600 tons at standard load made her technically subject to treaty limitations while remaining operationally inferior to properly designed fleet carriers that accepted their treaty obligations and focused on maximizing effectiveness within legal constraints. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's post-war analysis of Japanese carrier operations identifies Ryujo as an example of the strategic confusion that characterized Japanese naval planning in the years leading up to World War II, with competing priorities and conflicting requirements producing vessels that satisfied neither treaty obligations nor operational needs. The carrier's brief career demonstrates the futility of attempting to gain strategic advantage through legal technicalities rather than superior technology, training, and operational doctrine. The wreck of Ryujo lies on the bottom of the Solomon Sea at a depth of approximately 3,200 meters, serving as a permanent monument to the failure of treaty circumvention as a naval strategy and the importance of sound engineering principles in warship design. The carrier's rapid sinking under relatively light battle damage stands in stark contrast to the survival of properly designed carriers like Enterprise and Yorktown, which sustained heavy damage during the same period but remained afloat due to superior compartmentation, damage control capabilities, and structural integrity. Modern naval architects studying Ryujo's design and loss conclude that the carrier's fundamental problems stemmed from the impossible requirement to build a large aircraft carrier on a small ship's displacement, forcing designers to compromise essential characteristics like stability, protection, and damage control capability in pursuit of treaty compliance. The vessel's narrow beam, minimal armor, and lightweight construction created a ship that was inherently vulnerable to the stresses of combat operations while remaining difficult to operate safely even under peacetime conditions. The strategic impact of Ryujo's loss extends beyond the immediate tactical consequences to influence Japanese carrier aviation doctrine and construction priorities for the remainder of the war, with naval planners recognizing that quantity alone cannot substitute for quality in carrier design, and that treaty circumvention produces vessels that are operationally ineffective and strategically counterproductive. The Imperial Japanese Navy's subsequent focus on larger, better protected carriers like Taiho represents a belated recognition that effective aircraft carriers require substantial displacement, comprehensive armor protection, and robust damage control systems, regardless of treaty limitations. Commander Felt's strike group returns to USS Saratoga, having successfully demonstrated the vulnerability of lightly built aircraft carriers to concentrated air attack, with the rapid sinking of Ryujo validating American carrier aviation doctrine that emphasized coordinated bombing and torpedo attacks against high-value targets. The destruction of the Japanese carrier with minimal losses to the attacking force proves that properly trained carrier air groups can overwhelm inadequate defenses and inflict fatal damage on even heavily defended warships. The loss of Ryujo at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons marks a turning point in the Pacific War's carrier operations, as Japanese naval aviation begins to experience the cumulative effects of heavy losses among experienced aircrew, while American carrier forces grow stronger through improved training, better aircraft, and superior operational doctrine. The battle demonstrates that Japan's early advantages in carrier aviation are beginning to erode as American industrial production and pilot training programs reach full capacity. Post-war interrogation of Ryujo survivors reveals the extent to which the carrier's design problems affected crew morale and operational effectiveness throughout her career, with many officers and enlisted men expressing concerns about the ship's stability and seaworthiness that proved prophetic when the vessel was lost in her first major fleet engagement. The crew's awareness of their ship's limitations created a persistent undercurrent of anxiety that affected performance during critical operations and contributed to the vessel's poor reputation within the Imperial Japanese Navy. The technical analysis of Ryujo's wreck, conducted by deep-sea exploration teams in the 1990s, confirms the extent of the battle damage inflicted by Commander Felt's strike group while revealing additional structural failures caused by the ship's inadequate design and construction. The carrier's hull shows evidence of catastrophic structural collapse that occurred during the sinking process, with the lightweight construction and minimal internal bracing proving unable to withstand the stresses imposed by progressive flooding and loss of buoyancy. International naval experts studying the Ryujo incident conclude that the carrier's fate demonstrates the importance of international arms control agreements that focus on operational capabilities rather than technical specifications, as the Washington Naval Treaty's tonnage-based limitations encouraged the construction of vessels that were numerically compliant but operationally deficient. Modern treaty negotiations incorporate lessons learned from the Ryujo experience by establishing qualitative as well as quantitative restrictions on military equipment. The strategic legacy of Japan's failed experiment with treaty circumvention extends far beyond the loss of a single aircraft carrier to influence post-war understanding of the relationship between international law and military effectiveness, demonstrating that sustainable strategic advantage comes from superior technology and operational doctrine rather than clever legal interpretations of arms control agreements. Ryujo's brief career serves as a permanent reminder that military effectiveness cannot be achieved through bureaucratic cleverness, and that sound engineering principles must take precedence over legal technicalities in the design of weapons systems intended for combat operations. The prancing dragon that was meant to demonstrate Japanese naval ingenuity and treaty circumvention instead became a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing compliance over capability, leaving behind a legacy that influenced naval architecture, international law, and strategic thinking for generations after her sinking in the waters off Guadalcanal. The carrier's story reminds us that in the unforgiving environment of naval warfare, physics and engineering reality ultimately triumph over bureaucratic cleverness and legal manipulation, making effective design and construction the only reliable foundation for military success.